Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we are recording it for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. You're welcome to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to answer them online. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Jason Miller, Executive Editor of Federal News Radio.
Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are Lynn Cole, the Vice Commander of Naval Supply Systems Command Weapons Systems Support; Michael Scott, the Deputy Director of the Defense Logistics Agency Logistics Operations; Emile Monet, a cybersecurity strategist in the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at the Homeland Security Department; and Steve Rubley, the CEO of Thomson Reuters Special Services and Managing Director of the Government Segment. Welcome to the program. Welcome to the discussion. Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion. The topic of supply chain risk management is one that just keeps coming up more and more across the government. In fact, I was at a recent event with the General Services Administration's Federal Acquisition Service, and Bill Zielinski highlighted supply chain risk management and security as one of his 4 focused areas in 2018. He says to solve the federal cyber challenge, GSA and its partners must ensure the supply chain is secure at the beginning of the process and not at the end. He says GSA and all agencies, for that matter, have to understand how can they determine at the first point of contact that they have baked in those security requirements and understand what they're buying and who they're buying it from. The focus on supply chain risks is receiving a lot of attention beyond just GSA and acquisition. A new policy from the Committee on National Security Systems established an integrated organization-wide cybersecurity risk management program to achieve and maintain an acceptable level of cybersecurity risk for national security systems. Homeland Security Department and GSA, which we'll hear from later in the program, issued a new supply chain risk management plan for the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM, program in August. And the U.S.-China Security Commission is awaiting an unclassified report about the supply chain challenges agencies face in buying commercial technology. And finally, NASA has set up a value-added reseller program for its SOUP-5 contract to further ensure confidence in its vendor supply chain. But it's more than just technology and acquisition and cyber. The Government Accountability Office listed supply chain management as a high-risk area for the Defense Department since 1990. GAO says DoD manages about 4.9 million secondary inventory items, such as spare parts, worth about $91 billion. The supply chain risk management high-risk area focused on material distribution, asset visibility within DoD. And GAO says as of 2017, DoD has made some progress. It addresses weakness around inventory management, but still must improve asset visibility and its material distribution. So a lot there I covered, I know, but I'm going to turn to Lynn because I kind of ended there with a little DoD excitement. So let's talk supply chain. How are you guys at Naval Systems Supply addressing that challenge?
Well, we've been doing this business for a long time, and really our supply chain risk management all started off way back in the beginning, specifically when we introduced submarines to the fleet. And submarine safety is one of our most important things that we look at, and we've looked at for a long time. So we pattern a lot of our programs for supply chain risk management after what we do in those SubSafe programs. In the SubSafe program, we involve engineers very early in the design of things so that we build into the equipments the safety that needs to be there, the inspection requirements that have to be there, and the receipt inspection requirements that have to be there. So patterned after this, we identify any supply chain areas that have to be monitored with any level of security associated with them. And we make sure that up front we have the technical data, understand what we're buying. We make sure that we have the quality inspectors out there at the plants, making sure we do first article testing, that we follow the item through manufacture. So we have people from DoD out there on the plant floors watching the item be produced, as well as quality receipt people once it gets to the dockside or pier, wherever we're going to be using the part. So that's the pattern we follow with a lot of our systems to make sure that we have risk accounted for as we introduce parts to our fleet.
And when you talk about from the submarine side, I mean, that, forgive me, but it goes back to 1940s, 1950s?
Yes.
Or even before that?
It goes back to the beginning of the introduction of supply chain, but it really started off with this mindset with the accident on the USS Thresher.
Okay. So that's fascinating because you think submarines, you think the whole pieces and parts that go into that, and how does that kind of fall into kind of some of the other areas that you guys look at? Because buying a submarine is much different than buying a weapon or buying a, you know, pick a table.
So exactly, and that's where we look at specific supply classes, federal supply classes, or types of items that we buy. And we recognize now that we're moving on, we're buying more than like valves for submarines and propulsion parts. We've moved into an area of electronics. So we make sure under cybersecurity that we are planning and purchasing and designing systems with the same level of rigor and understanding of the pedigree of the items that we're introducing to our supply chain as we do for any part that could cause a loss of life on a submarine.
Steve, let me move over to you, because one thing that Thomson Reuters does is help people like Lynn and others kind of understand that big focus area. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing from your government customers.
Well, what we're seeing, I mean, first of all, we think of it as a partnership. I mean, I think it's incumbent on all of us in the commercial side and government to try to work together on this topic. We're seeing a much longer supply chain. We're seeing a much more global supply chain and ultimately much more complex. And so when we think of our government customers and we think about the complexity in today's world, open source information is critical to really understanding the risk. And we kind of think about it in 4 buckets and helping our customers. One of them is just in terms of price risk and the fluctuation of currency, the market risk, the price of raw materials, just from a cost standpoint. Then we think of disruption in the actual supply chain and things like natural disasters and geopolitical events around the world. How can that be surfaced up intelligently and quickly so that there could be a plan B, right? And that's a lot of from open source information. And then we of course think of the risk of the suppliers, which is if things like sanctions and bribery and human trafficking and human slavery, what's all down into the supply chain, and how can we best help our customers see those red flags. And then finally, it's more about, okay, that's great at the time, but then there has to be the continuous evaluation, right? And making sure that new companies, new suppliers, and even current suppliers don't get into that red flag area.
And I imagine it's the continuous evaluation piece of that that's really getting a lot more attention nowadays. You can kind of look at the price. There's some price and disruption in the chain. You can't really predict it per se, but you can. That's easy to see. It's the continuous evaluation that, okay, today they're good, but will they be good tomorrow? I imagine that's the most difficult one.
It is, absolutely. And it's about, it's not just about the company, but it's also about, in the supply chain, maybe a change of an officer, right? An officer who has had a history of bribery or has a history of some kind of just nefarious activity.
It could be gambling. It could be.
Yeah.
It could be sickness.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't have to be anything nefarious, right?
Yeah. It's not the companies that do bad things. It's the people behind the companies. So you have to take that into consideration.
I think you made Emil shiver for a second. So let's talk a little bit about supply chain. I didn't ruin your talk here, but I know your focus has been cybersecurity, CDM as an example. Talk a little bit about how you guys are looking at supply chain from DHS.
Sure. So, the federal government, our state and local governments, the critical infrastructure owner-operators, all of us as consumers are increasingly dependent on commercial information and communications technology to live our daily lives as consumers and accomplish our missions as federal agencies. And so we recognize at DHS that the ICT supply chain, and it's global, as Steve mentioned, is a significant source of risk to the department and to the homeland writ large. So we are beginning to address these issues, and Steve brought up a few of those around, who are the companies that we are doing business with, and who are the people that are running those companies, and what are the locations that those companies operate in, what are the laws that those companies operate under, and then also what are the deliverables that those companies are providing to us. Is it a product? Is it a printed circuit board, for example, a microelectronic? Is it a service, right? And for products or services, you're going to look at different you're going to look at different things in terms of risk. And really, Jason, this is about risk management. You know, you're not going to eliminate risk in the global supply chain. We know that the global supply chain is a good thing. It gets us access to technology quickly and cheaply, relatively speaking. And so we just need to learn to live in this new world.
And I think you bring up a very interesting point, because there's actually a Supreme Court case that's being talked about right now about laws, and we could talk about that all the program, but cloud and whether or not a company who has a cloud instance in a different country, do they have to abide by it? That's a supply chain risk now. I mean, you didn't think about it probably 3 or 4 years ago, but now it's part of it. So, Emil, just talk briefly about how are you guys you highlighted 4 or 5 different areas around risk management, which it's not an order. You don't do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but how are you guys addressing maybe a couple of those?
Everything is contextual, right? Your supply chain risk for one program is not necessarily going to be the same as your supply chain risk for another program. So I'll take the CDM program, for example. You mentioned that in the lead-in. What we've done there is really take a good look at what are the things that we are buying, what are the products that we are buying for that program, and it tends to be software, right? And that software is relatively mature. It's a technology readiness level 9, and it tends to be purchased by that program from original manufacturers or their authorized resellers, right? And so we knew that, and that's been consistent over time. What we didn't know was how is that software produced? And that's what we really started to focus in on for the program. So we're beginning to ask those manufacturers and those resellers to ask the manufacturers that they're selling their products to us, do you make your software in a secure development lifecycle that's documented? Will you share that documentation with us as the program so that we can get a better level of assurance about what you're doing? Is it adequately protecting us? And so we've added a number of sort of questions. We have a pretty simple questionnaire that goes out to the manufacturers, and it's a yes/no question. Do you use a secure development lifecycle? Do you do independent testing? Will you provide that information to the government upon request? We've gotten a lot of yes answers, not very many no answers, as you might expect.
A good sign.
Right, it is a good sign. And now we're taking that information and making it available to the program managers and the engineers as they're crafting a CDM solution for a particular agency or set of agencies, so that they can make a decision about how does that supply chain risk best fit into my enterprise risk at that agency where I'm implementing CDM.
All right. Let's turn to Mike Scott from DLA. Talk a little bit about supply chain risk management from your perspective.
Thanks, Jason. So first, for Defense Logistics Agency, we're talking 9 global supply chains, over 5 million items we manage, $35+ billion a year kind of size of the company, doing a lot of automated acquisition. So for us, supply chain risk, I'd put it into 3 main categories. First, like Lynn described, we really have the best controls we can on our processes. End-to-end processes, the management of them, all the way from initial planning for parts and supplies, through contractor vetting, testing, all the way through end-to-end supply chain. The second area I would say for us is a little newer, and I call this your topic of supply chain security. That is becoming a much larger focus for us. Fraudulent actors, intrusions into the supply chain, and our oversight and how we monitor and overcome those things that are happening much more often for us. And third, for a business like ours, we really focus on resiliency, surge ability within our supply chain for when we do have issues, and like Steve talked about, we have multiple means to bring support to bear for our military customers. And those are probably the 3 platforms that we talk supply chain risk.
Talk a little bit about the supply chain security piece. We've talked a little bit about it, but why is that all of a sudden higher up, if you will, in your priority list, or why did it raise up?
Well, so that started for us, Jason, with counterfeit parts is a major thing for us. And a few years ago, we began looking at new technologies. One of the big ones we use is DNA marking for certain types of materials, so that we can assure kind of the life cycle of the parts that it truly is a DoD part and not some bad actor getting into the business. The more recent things we're getting into involve true, I'd say, bad actors that are using different means to try to penetrate the supply chain. They go after this in terms of financial perspectives, even into areas of let's say the entities that we deal with from a supplier perspective, and trying to manipulate the supply chain. So that is probably the most current thing we're dealing with, and it's something every week seems like we find something and we deal with it, and it's a challenge to get ahead of that curve, if you will.
Lynn, let me bring you in on this, because I think the DNA marking piece is fascinating side of it. Very similar, I imagine you guys have very similar challenges as Mike does at DLA. When you look at the obstacles you're facing, as you look at the things you have to overcome, I mean, how are you guys using the DNA marking as an example, or whatever else type of, how do you move forward?
So introducing the majority of our parts, DLA actually does a lot of the buying for the items that we use, and we manage the inventory. We do buy the repairs of those parts. In the Navy, it's pretty unique because with the technology that's introduced on board our ships, and the categories of items that are safety items, critical air safety items, critical submarine safety items, critical nuclear propulsion safety items, we make sure that we are getting into the area of serial number tracking, that we understand of the components that we're, not just the consumables, but the things that we repair, as we repair and replace them, that we have the pedigree of them going through the system. We understand who's touched them, where they have been, and follow that through the life cycle end to end of where that part has been. So we have systems that we're developing at this point in time that are getting more into big data and understanding where we're going with serial number tracking to get even more understanding of who's touching that, where's touching that, what parts are being introduced to that, and where we're introducing any risk.
Remember the old days when you could just put an RFID tag on it and we thought we had it made? Never again. All right, let's take a quick break. We'll come back and continue our conversation. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Risk Proofing the Government Supply Chain, sponsored by Thomson Reuters on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.